Reciban un saludo muy cordial. Todas las personas que nos estén viendo en este momento, les damos la bienvenida a un nuevo episodio de Saga sin fronteras, que es nuestro más reciente e interesante proyecto audiovisual, el cual busca pues que filósofas y filósofos del exterior hagan comunidad académica aquí en nuestro país, confirmando así, tal vez y solo tal vez, pues que Saga es hoy la revista estudiantil de filosofía más importante de Colombia. Este programa está en línea con los que han sido, son y seguirán siendo los dos objetivos principales de la revista Saga. El primero, crear comunidad académica, y el segundo, difundir la filosofía para un público amplio. Now, English time. Hello everyone, I hope you're well. Welcome to a new episode of Saga Without Borders. With the project, we are trying to disseminate to the public and to philosophy students in Latin America what philosophers from different countries are investigating nowadays. Español otra vez. En el capítulo de hoy tendremos a una invitada súper especial, pero antes de presentarla, pues voy a presentar a su entrevistador. Joseph Rueda, pues es estudiante del pregrado en Filosofía en la Universidad Nacional de Colombia y fue director de la revista Saga durante el año 2020. Ha sido columnista en Libremente FM y actualmente se encuentra trabajando en la prestigiosa y bien conocida revista El Malpensante. Joseph, bienvenido.
Muchas gracias por la invitación y muchas gracias a Butler, pues la profesora Butler, por aceptar conversar con nosotros en este espacio.
Bien, ahora presentaría pues a nuestra invitada, que es la profesora Judith Butler. La profesora Butler es catedrática del Departamento de Literatura Comparada de la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Es una destacada activista y filósofa, y sus aportaciones en los campos de la teoría feminista, de la teoría queer y de los estudios de género han causado un notable impacto pues, en ámbitos tan diversos como lo son la teoría política, los estudios literarios, el psicoanálisis o el derecho. Entonces, profesor Butler, welcome. Y para nuestros espectadores, no olviden activar los subtítulos.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for this invitation.
As you, Professor Butler, heard, my name is Joseph Rueda, and I'm going to be talking with you. Last year, I was editor-in-chief of Saga, and during that time, we created and we organized a number dedicated to gender and feminism, in which you're quoted, of course, and you were discussed a lot. So I hope that our viewers and readers will be looking forward to read that special issue. So, well, now that Sergio introduced you, I want to clarify that Professor Butler, they go by the pronouns she or they. So I will be addressing her or their like indifferently, okay? I want to welcome everyone, and I want to introduce Professor Butler. I guess that for those, and I guess that's kind of hard, but for those who don't know who Judith Butler is, she's a philosopher from the United States who has offered numerous contributions to ethics, political philosophy, feminism, and gender studies. One of her or their most praised works, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, has become a must-read for people that are interested in understanding how the categories of sex and gender operate in discourse and language, and how gender is rather a performance and it's not determined by biological sex. In fact, the book questions the very notion and implications of sex, conceived as something essential. Her latest book, The Force of Nonviolence, an ethico-political bent, published back in 2020, discusses the possibility of understanding nonviolence as an ethical response to current forms of power, and in opposition to the notion of nonviolence understood as passivity. Thank you so much, Professor Butler, for joining us today.
Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Okay, so well, before we start this interview, I would like to dedicate this conversation to Alejandra Monocuco and all of the transgender women in Colombia and all around the globe that have been murdered, excluded only because of their existence. In Colombia, only during 2021, 15 transgender women have been killed. The latest one was murdered last week. We ask justice to Alejandra Monocuco and all of the transgender women who have been violated, discriminated, and killed. Now, I would like to talk about Alejandra's case. Alejandra was a sexual worker. She was a transgender Afro-Colombian woman, and she lived with HIV. Last year, during the pandemic, in the month of May, she had some respiratory issues. They called an ambulance, and as soon as the people who were helping her knew that she was an HIV patient, that she had HIV, they left her and they said that she was going through an episode of overdose. She died, and the second ambulance that arrived to her house found her dead, unfortunately. Alejandra was also a victim of the internal Colombian armed conflict, and she went through a lot of discrimination and exclusion during her life. Actually, when she died, they took the municipality took almost like 15 hours to take her body, and they thought that they said her friends and family, they claimed that she had COVID, but no one could knew because they cremated her body before any type of authorization from her family. So we ask justice for her, and now that I gave the context, what do you think are the conditions for someone like Alejandra to experience and be experienced as something that you would call a precarious life? If we say that every human deserves a dignified life, a livable life, it is easy to say that yes, that every human has that right. But when it comes to the real world, we see that that claim is not as universal as we think. Why do you think that happens?
Well, first of all, thank you for telling me the story of Alejandra. I'm sorry that I was never able to meet her. And I gather she was beloved by her friends and co-workers and family. And I'm sorry also that her situation is like the situation of so many trans people in the world, trans and travesti, who are singled out for their gender appearance, who are hated and discriminated against because they are living in their bodies as they must and as they wish. And this right to live in one's body as one must and as one wishes is crucial. It's a fundamental right that should belong to all people. So when you say, well, everyone has a right to shelter, to housing, to health services, to political self-determination, the right to move in the world, to walk down the street without fear of violence. I mean, we are, when we speak in the universal, in that way, everyone has the right, we are saying everyone should have the right. It's a normative claim. It's not a descriptive claim. And in fact, we need that normative universal in order to see the fundamental rights that are lacking and to understand why such lives are destroyed. And in this case, destroyed without a trace, right? They incinerated that body without authorization, you tell me. What is it they are hiding? They don't want an exam of that body. What is it they are effacing? And we know in Colombia, by virtue of the period of time called la violencia, right? We know the practices of killing and hiding the trace. But we also know that those same practices continue in Colombia and many countries, even if we don't call the contemporary time la violencia. I don't know, maybe we should say that this is also la violencia. We are still in the violencia, no? The effacement of the trace of the death is a way of refusing accountability and thwarting the ability of any body of inquiry to do justice to that life that was vanquished, that could have been saved, right? You're also telling me there was one visit by the ambulance where she was having trouble breathing. If they had taken her and given her oxygen and helped her, then she very well perhaps could have lived. So they abandoned her first, and then they found her dead. So there are two acts here, and that abandonment is also like killing. We have to think about that as abandonment in the face of precarity, the same as killing. Maybe it is. Killing takes different forms. Violence, as you know too well, takes different forms.
Well, now that you talk about vulnerability and that you explain the conditions that exacerbate a precarious life, I would like to ask you, some of the people that talk about your work, they say that it cannot be applied to countries like from the south of the world, because the conditions and the politics are different. However, I wonder if that is completely accurate, because I think that even though the conditions of transgender women in the United States or in the UK, they are different from the conditions that a transgender women live in a Latin American or African country. I think that some of the notions that you discussed in your work, they can be understood here. What is it from your perspective that can be discussed in the Latin American context in regards to LGBT rights and women's rights?
Well, first of all, let me say that, I wrote Gender Trouble almost 35 years ago because I wrote it before it was published. And so, I'm a lot older now, and I would not write the same book now. I also wrote many other things after Gender Trouble, which became more global in character. And I've worked extensively with Latin American feminists on different projects, and I have learned an enormous amount from Latin American feminism, queer theory, the trans movement. It's a very important exchange for me. So I allow myself to be changed by those I meet and who challenge me from different parts of the world. But you're right, 35 years ago, where was I? I was living in an American problem, US problem, let's call it that, a US problem, cultural problem in relationship to France and their theory, and, very Euro-Atlantic, the framework. So that's a legitimate criticism. But, when books become translated, they become different books. It's no longer the same book. It's a different book. It belongs to another language. It even, I think, belongs more to the translator than to the author. So for instance, I think it's El Género in Disputa in in Spanish. It has a life in Buenos Aires. It has a life in Mexico City. Many people read and they use it. They take what they want from it, right? They take something from here, they take something else, but that's good. They don't have to take the whole book and say yes to the whole book or no to the whole. Yeah, this is useful for us here in our language, in our history. And then it becomes something else in Spanish. It becomes something else in Russian. It becomes something else in Japanese, right? And then that comes back to me. People say, oh, we found this in your work, and it was very useful because this is our struggle. Or this is our, so then I, as an author, learn about different parts of the world, and I change my mind. So I see it as a collective, collaborative enterprise over time. The book becomes a different book. I become a different author. People take from it and reject it as they wish. And that's good because it lives differently and it lives in bits and pieces in different parts of the world.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I mean, we Sergio and I, we love Gadamer, so I guess that this is some sort of hermeneutics of approach to your book. I think that your book is useful because, for example, I have been thinking about the AIDS and HIV crisis and how we understand HIV lives, and I'm going to be asking you some things about that. But I consider, and I guess that that was part of the question, that even though the discussions might have raised from a different, as you said, they can enlighten, and of course they can, with that enlightenment, they can reply back with annotations and with replies. And I think that your work is really rich in that sense. So now related to that, you in excitable speech and in Bodies That Matter and Gender Trouble, you discuss the category of women and how sex and gender, they cannot be thought as this essential category. And there is a claim when the Alejandra's case happened. Some people rejected the fact that she was left alone and that she was not taken care of. But they said, and they claimed, that even though they reject violence against transgender individuals, they cannot accept that a transgender woman, they say that in Colombia, of course, some people say that they are, and I quote unquote, confused men. So what do you think, or what would you say to those people? Would you consider that position problematic, saying, no, I do not accept violence, but they are not who they say they are? But they cannot be harmed, but they are not who they say they are. How would you answer? Because to those claims, I see them, and they are quite problematic, because one side, they are not accepting violence against transgender people, but at the same time, they commit some sort of violent act when they do not accept their identities. Do you think that that might be the correlation between violence against transgender individuals? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Joseph, I think you and I probably agree here that to deny the womanhood of a trans woman, to deny the category that she has taken for herself, the category through which she lives, the category that she has also renewed in the course of her life, right? What does it mean to be a woman? Alejandra has a way of living that. She has realized that category in her life. So to deny that, to refuse to recognize her as she is and has been, is a form of linguistic violence, cultural violence, symbolic violence. So even if one is against physical violence, we have to realize that when we deny those categories that people have taken for themselves out of necessity and out of desire, we deny who they are, we deny their dignity. And to deny the dignity of the other person is to set the stage for physical violence, right? It may not be a physically violent act, but it is to nullify that existence. Violence, murderous violence, and medical negligence based on transphobia or the phobia of AIDS, all of these are forms of either killing or letting die or saying that you do not deserve to live under the category which has made your life livable. So that is a violence. That is surely a violence.
In regards to that, now that we are talking about linguistic violence, there has been a construction of a way that we talk about transgender women, gay people, lesbians, bisexuals, and people who live with AIDS. Alejandra, and of course African American people. I mean, you name it. Of course, I would love to talk about all of those categories here, but Alejandra, la red comunitaria trans, which is an organization that fights for transgender women and sexual workers right here in Colombia. They claim that that act, what happened to Alejandra, was not only transphobia, but also a case of xerophobia, right?
Yes, yes.
And in your recent works, you have highlighted the importance of grief in undoing gender, and of course in the force of nonviolence, there is something there about that. Why is grieving so important in cases such as Alejandra's? And how can someone who is not interested in grieving her, for example, how can grief be understood? And how can someone understand that she deserved to be grieved? Especially when you think about cases in which they might say, well, she had HIV, like she didn't deserve to live any longer, because that's what some people say. I mean, there is a construction of like an idea that people who live with HIV, they are not deserving of having a healthy life or a sexual active life. What are your thoughts on that? How can grief let us understand HIV people who live with HIV? For example, is grief useful to gain more sensibility about the HIV/AIDS crisis or the discussion? And can it be useful now that HIV is not longer a death sentence for people that can access, of course, to a treatment and live a healthy, long life? How can the discussion about grieving give more humane resources to consider those lives without being condescending or tragic or dramatic? Can it be an approach to the eradication of like discriminatory emotions like disgust and fear?
Well, thank you. I think those are all excellent questions, and I don't know whether I can answer them all. But you know, the question of open grieving or of public grieving is a very important one. It's one we're all living with now in the pandemic, depending what stage we're in, or whether people are dying around us or have died, or some are still dying. We don't have easy ways to publicly acknowledge the death of our neighbors, of other people in the world, people who we may not know, but the loss of whom we certainly do know about. HIV has always presented a problem with public grieving, and even in the early days, in the United States, but in other places in the world, people felt very ashamed about having HIV. They still do. I mean, you're telling me that people there treated Alejandra in a shameful way, right? She was shamed for being seropositive. So, and even here, I mean, a good friend of mine was tested positive last year, and he was like, "Don't tell anybody." It's like, oh my God, really? Still, we don't say? But apparently, there is a lot of stigma and shame. And of course, for gay people, for sex workers, for people who use drugs and who become infected with HIV that way, in any of those ways, are very often demeaned, and the value of their lives is considered to be diminished. They are held responsible for the illness that they contracted, or they are understood as lives that can be lost. They can be forgotten about because they are not lives that have dignity or value. So we see that there's a structure of inequality that informs our approach to grieving. Who can be openly grieved, who cannot? And, you know, we also live in the world as people who feel like, oh, somebody's going to grieve me if I go, or no one is going to grieve me if I go. Or maybe some people will grieve me and others will just treat this as nothing, that it won't matter at all. They don't consider this a life. They don't mourn the death. But if we agree that people should live a dignified life and that all people should be treated with equal value, then we also, I think, are committed to the proposition that all people deserve a dignified death and ought to have a sense that they are of value and they will be mourned. And when they die, they ought to be mourned. And mourning as an open or public practice is a way of acknowledging, yes, this was a life, and it was a life of value, and this is a loss, and this is a loss that is being mourned. We miss this person. This is a diminished world without this person. So it is, when we talk about grieving, public and open grieving especially, we're talking about how to mark the value of a life, how to accept and affirm that this is a loss, maybe a personal loss, maybe a collective loss, maybe a global loss. In some cases, we feel that way. You know, my sense is that especially for LGBTQI people who are told that they are not real, their gender is not real, their love is not real, their desire is wrong. When they love someone or they're attached to someone and they lose that person, that is a real loss. And yet we have to struggle. We still, to this day, have to struggle to affirm that our losses are real losses, that our loves are real loves, and that our lives are, through whatever social category they are articulated, are dignified and valuable lives. And it is appalling to me that these simple facts, which should be accepted in human societies as moral necessities, as ethical precepts, are something for which we have to struggle politically. But we do. We still do.
Thank you so much for that answer. I would like to ask you something else related to that. There is an anecdote that you tell in some interviews about some incident that, well, it was not an incident, it was just something that happened at Berkeley, that someone called you lesbian.
Yes.
And you said, yes, I am. It was something like that. And you explained that it was taking a term that was meant to be mean and discriminatory, and you resignify that. And I have seen that with transgender women and with people who live with HIV, they now take that term. For example, here they call HIV the bug, el bicho, or transgender women are called. There is a derogatory term in English that is called tranny or shemale.
Yeah.
And some, they have, or queer itself, they have taken that term and they have transformed it. What do you think can be the contributions to people who live or who are going to live with HIV or who are going to be transgender for these resignifications of the term? Now HIV does not necessarily mean a death sentence, but it can mean resignification of your life.
Yes.
For example, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, in that case, you know, when it was a woman, young woman, who saw me walking down the street, and she actually asked me a question. She said, "Are you a lesbian?" And so I just turned, and I saw that it was supposed to put me on the spot, make me feel uncomfortable, make me feel targeted, looked at. And so I just turned and I said, "Yes, I am," you know, just like, you know, "Yes, I am." And it was a way of accepting the category that she gave me. I mean, I don't know, do I call myself a lesbian now? Yes, I suppose I am, but maybe I'm non-binary, so lesbian doesn't always work. I mean, I could have sat her down and said, "Okay, look, it's complicated. This is the way it works. This is what," you know what I mean? Like, but she wasn't in my class, or we weren't doing a personal interview. So I couldn't really explain the complexities. But the fact of the matter is that we all, we're working with the language that we receive. The names we're called, and sometimes we keep those names, and sometimes we do not. Or we try to develop our own language, maybe using language that's already in play, refusing some, or even creatively trying to find language that is more in tune with who we understand ourselves to be, or what we understand ourselves to want. So, you know, language is historical, it changes. I mean, you know, there was a time, you know, when certain women, if they were big and strong, or, you know, that they would not be called women, you know, they were like monsters or something. And now, yeah, they're women. Or certain ideas of masculinity are no longer quite what they used to be, maybe in some parts of the world. Or sometimes masculinity signifies one way in one part of the world and not in another. So these are changeable. They're changeable characteristics. They're deep. They affect us all. We all struggle with them. Maybe we play with them, but they are in the making. They make us. They form us. But we also have some say about how we work with them. I mean, if I resignify an insult, that doesn't set me free. It doesn't change the world. It doesn't end discrimination or violence. But maybe it's a way of thinking about living in a world where power seems to be everywhere, right? We are treated a certain way. We are blocked from voting, or we're blocked from certain public spaces, or we are treated as if we're inferior, or even as if we deserve to die. And so then the question is, how do you take up a position in the middle of that? I mean, there was a story I read about Colombia where a woman, it was about sexual violence on the street, and a policeman came up to her. She was a protester, and he said something like, let's rape her, or how shall we rape her? And her response was to say, go ahead and rape me. And she didn't really mean go ahead and rape me, but she occupied language in a way to say, your language, it does not defeat me. You do not scare me. I am still powerful. I still exist. I can take your hideous language and bring it right back to you. And he was, of course, apparently, according to the story I read, the policeman was, shocked. She's supposed to be a pure victim, and here she's saying, yeah, go ahead. Now, it's a linguistic act that defies the power that exists. She seems to have escaped the rape in that case, but she's somebody who has experienced sexual assault on the street. There's no question about that. So it's not like a strategy that will be the same as ultimate emancipation, but it's a way of recognizing that we live in a world where language has its own power to injure, but it also has a power of defiance. And sometimes we can take the very instrument that is meant to destroy us and lift it up and push it in the other direction. And I've seen that. I've seen that in social movements, in popular assemblies, and it can be at least a way of saying, I am still alive, I still have power in language. The language you use against me will not defeat me. I can take the power in that phrase and turn it back and turn it against you. So that's powerful in my view. It's not the ultimate form of power, but it's one form of power.
Thank you so much for that answer, Professor Butler. Now, I would like to ask you something short. Well, I always say that my questions are short and they are long because I have so many things to ask you. I'm sorry. But
Okay.
Now that you talk about power and how power is installed in the bodies of the people, in language, I would like to think about power being installed in public spaces. How is that? It's a known fact that, transgender women and men being transgender or being LGBTQI is difficult. And recently, I have been thinking about the way in which institutional marginalization of these non-normative identities are rejected, but that rejection is not only found in discourse or in institutions themselves. Like, for example, a person who lives with HIV is not treated as it should be by a doctor, or a person who a women or a transgender women or whatever you call, like, you name it, because there are so many examples here. They are excluded from housing. You said it, but educational environments, employment, but also in the cities themselves. And for example, as a transgender woman, you cannot go to some places or go to some places in some specific hours. What do you think are the consequences of not being able to inhabit a city, a community, in a political but also in a bodily perspective? How can we, for example, build queer friendly, women friendly, African American friendly cities and spaces, and what would be the contributions for that? What would be the advantages for us queer and transgender and HIV people?
Yes. Well, look, if we want to live in a democracy, if we understand our collective right as people to live in a democracy, and democracy implies freedom to associate with whomever you wish, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. And it also implies that there are public institutions and public spaces, buildings, educational organizations, streets, libraries, that belong to all of us. right? They are public. We have access to them. Everyone should have equal access. That's also part of the principle of equality that is essential to any idea of democracy. So if, as a trans person, you are stopped from entering the public square or an educational institution or a public health institution, you're not only denied medication, education, and housing, which are enormous forms of deprivation, but you are also not permitted to live in a democracy. In other words, the public world is for others, but not for you. And, you know, we see this in the United States with the undocumented. Even though they are in the public world, they are not allowed to be in the public world. They are not getting the same healthcare. They are not getting the same education, and yet they belong here. They live here. They work here. They are essential to our economy. They're part of the people. They're part of who we are. But there's also, obviously, and we see this during the pandemic, the fact that Black and brown people in the North and in the South do not get the same level of health care, and they die at higher rates from COVID. And they die of higher rates, not just because they didn't get medical attention or access to the vaccine, although both of those are true, but because they have a long-standing deprivation, a deprivation that has been built over many years, the years of their lives, so that their health is not as strong as those who are constantly seeing doctors and being the recipients of medical provision and treatment. So those forms of systemic inequality result in different mortality rates. And we see that inequality in its systemic forms determines who will die young and who will live long. I mean, at least statistically speaking, not in every instance, but statistically speaking, who is more likely to live longer, who is more likely to die young. And, you know, when you say people treated Alejandra's death as nothing because she had HIV, you are saying to me that they considered her already on the way to death, or they didn't see her seropositive status as making her eligible for treatment so that she could live. The fact that she had the status and was trans and was a sex worker and was Afro-Colombian, you know, means that she was not given the same health. She was not given the same medical treatment and was more likely to die. And we saw that played out in the way that her death actually happened. She was deprived of medical care again, right? That's not the first time she was deprived, I would wager.
Thank you so much for that answer. In regards to that case, you have talked in your recent books about like the role of some emotions in political life, especially the role of grieving, as we were discussing it some minutes ago. And I guess that when you talk about this relation, this bodily relation that we have to others, in your books, and when you talk about mourning and grieving, I see that I might say, I might be wrong, but I see that those emotions they implied more emotions, love, empathy. Well, empathy can be thought as an emotion at some degree. Well, there's a big discussion with that, but empathy, love, even rage, for example, dignified rage, or I mean the emotions that we have in the public sphere, and we see that those emotions are being considered right now in this political discussion, because before emotions were not thought as political somehow. or they were not into the discussion of the political life. But also there are emotions that are discriminatory and that they exclude people. For example, disgust in the case of HIV people, or hatred, or anger. Um, how can we um, how can we start to well, not to eradicate, but to take emotions far from the that they're being directed at, for example, disgust, because it seems that, for example, being an HIV person, a person who lives with HIV, it means that you are now disgusting for some people. How can we understand those emotions that are not positive, but also for them live?
Thank you, Joseph. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to hear every word in the last question, but I think I understand some essential characteristics of that question. So let me try to answer. Well, first of all, we cannot control when and where people feel disgust. And it's one thing to feel disgust, it's another thing to express disgust. And it's a third thing to treat someone as if they are disgusting through conduct or through institutional policy or practice. So somebody might have a private feeling of disgust, and they may also not feel very good about the fact that they feel disgust, right? They might have an initial feeling of disgust and then think, oh, why am I feeling disgust? This is just a trans person or a seropositive person. What is my disgust about? They can think that through. They can talk about it with others. They can work it through so that they transform their emotions into something else, or realize maybe they were identifying, or they had fear, or they were afraid of catching AIDS. It was irrational. I mean, so I don't fault people for what they feel. You know, we might all feel disgust and anger and hatred even, but I do hold people accountable for how they live that out and what they do with that. So, you know, in the force of nonviolence, for instance, I suggest that maybe only those who have thought about murder or been led to think about doing violence to someone, they are the ones who know best what nonviolence is, because they take themselves back. They say no, they check their impulse. They say, oh, I want that. Why do I want that? But they don't act on that. And they also maybe sometimes, even often, realize they want something else, which is they want a world in which people are not doing violence in that way. They actually want a less violent world. So, you know, sometimes those really difficult emotions come up in conflict with others. And we need to be able to discuss those in community, maybe, you know, in counseling or in social movements, wherever we live, through art. Art is a great place to play that out. Films are a great place to play that out. So we need to embrace the complexity of human emotion, even the deeply negative parts. We may be ashamed of the fact that we feel disgust, right? We may be frightened of the fact that we feel violently, but we can craft those passions more than we sometimes think. Rage can be made creative. Rage can be put in the service of justice and not in the service of violence. And learning how to do that is a practice. I even would say it's an ethical practice on the self. It's a collective practice that social movements have. When you're so angry, you're so outraged, someone has been left to die, someone has been killed, or many people, understanding violence as the impulse, the immediate impulse of reaction, I understand that. But then what do any of us do with that immediate impulse? How do we think about it? Where does it come from? And how do we reconcile our own conduct with the version of the world that we want to live in? And that's I think we're all philosophers asking, what is the best way to live, or how to lead a good life in the middle of some pretty terrible political times. And it's a huge challenge. That said, I think it's too often the case that the public disgust against trans lives, or against gay, lesbian, non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, people with disabilities, people of African descent, this all has to be fought. It all has to be fought, because once that becomes normalized, then people who live with those deep prejudices can communicate them to others, and others feel like it's okay. It's not only okay to feel that way, it's obligatory to feel that way. It becomes part of a certain kind of group membership, right? We belong to a group that feels disgust about these other people. So when we think about hyper masculine normativity, right? It will be disgusted by women. It will be disgusted by trans people. It will be disgusted by homosexuality. But, there's also movements to break that form of masculinism down. And trans men are also doing a very good job of that. They're reimagining masculinity, which is a really important thing to do.
Well, can you hear me? You told me that I had some issues with my internet connection. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Now, well, I think that I will have to ask you now about. I was trying to ask you about this emotional education. So thank you for that. I really think that emotions are really important in the political discussion of life in general. And now I would like to discuss something else that is also deeply related with emotions, and that is a problematic discussion, because it causes so much feelings, and it has a lot of perspectives to it. But you have said in some of your work that being able to think gender in a wider perspective, to think about gender as a bigger possibility beyond this binary construction. Some people, in answer to that position, of course, they have said that the new gender identities, they do not solve the issue regarding violence against cisgender women and the LGBT plus community, and that the problem we need to solve is the very abolition of the notion and the category of gender. In that way, do you think that increasing the possibilities of gender can conclude, for example, to an abolition of this gender category, but not in the radical realm of feminism, but an abolition of understanding gender as something fixed and essential? And why is gender still, or do you think is still necessary to the political and ethical discussion of a social community? What if new forms of gender are possible? How does this affect the way that we live in a community? I mean, can, for example, the expansion of the possibilities of gender can conclude to its abolition in a more, inclusive way?
There are many ways to answer your large and important question. So let me see if I can do justice to your question. I have a lot of anxiety at the beginning that I won't be able to. All right, first, I have a little joke for you. There once was a time in which gender was abolished because all humans, the only humans, were men. We only had one gender. It was a beautiful time, right? It was perfect. There were cis men, and they were called human, and everybody else was non-human. So we didn't have to worry about gender. We had one gender. It was generic. It was universal, and that took care of everything. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that it didn't allow women to be recognized as different or to be recognized as human. It didn't see that the human creature comes into being through sex assignment of various kinds. Sometimes it's wrong. I mean, sometimes, and it must be revisable in principle, in my view. But and then I think many of us saw that binary system didn't really describe how people are actually living, how they're feeling, how they understand themselves. So there was a lot of anxiety and suffering trying to decide which one am I and how do I conform, and here are these norms and these ideals of what gender is supposed to be, and I'm supposed to be like that. I can't be like that. I mean, how many people live like that? Like, I can't be like that, or I must be like that. I must work harder to be like that. So gender norms are not natural. They're a source of enormous anxiety, desire, fantasy, fear throughout human life. I mean, some people are like, yes, I'm a man, and yes, I'm a woman, and it's all great. And I love them. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled. I'm really glad that they get to live that way. Mwah, beautiful. Some people say, I don't want to mess with gender. I like my gender. I love that. That's good if they like their gender. They even like the gender they were assigned at birth. Beautiful. That's great. However, even if they're happy, there are a lot of people who are not so happy, who said, this is not working for me. This is actually a sign of enormous suffering, sometimes to the point of suicide, or to the point of incredible anxiety, or protracted social suffering, or isolation. So in order to alleviate that suffering, it seems to me we need to open categories. It's not just because we're playful and creative, although we are, that's important too, but sometimes we have to be playful and creative in order to alleviate the condition of suffering, of not conforming, and feeling stigmatized, of feeling like we don't even exist, or that we're living in a world that has no place for us. So let's remember that gender norms, they can be beautiful for some people, but they can be very oppressive to others. And as I said, even those who find it beautiful should be aware that it's not beautiful for everybody, and be attentive and be mindful and care about that. So, so that's one thing. Do I think that the proliferation of gender categories would lead to the end or abolition of gender altogether? Well, I have no way of knowing. I understand why people want to think that way. I have some appreciation for that as an experiment. Why not? People have written whole novels trying to live without gender, without pronouns. It's an important experiment. It helps us think about the historical realities in which we live. But as far as I'm concerned, and in this lifetime that happens to be mine historically, I don't see us getting to the point of abolishing gender. I think that there are still many who are imposing very severe gender norms. And we see in the anti-gender ideology movement, which has swept through Latin America, both the Catholic Church and the Evangelical Church, that they are trying to order us back into heteronormative families, into certain ideas of masculinity and femininity, into gender hierarchy, into gender binarism, into compulsory heterosexuality. So as long as they're around, and they've now moved to Eastern Europe and Africa and East Asia, we have a big struggle. We have a struggle to insist on the complexity of gender and even now the right to study gender in school. Right? We're struggling for that. We're studying for the rights of gender studies programs, of scholarship on gender, teaching on gender, so people can learn to think about the complexity of biology, of culture, of psychological life, of power, of desire. And so in my lifetime, I don't see it. I can't predict what will happen after I'm gone. Maybe someone will send me a postcard and tell me how it went. But I just don't see it right now. You know,
Okay.
we struggle. It's not that, oh, we are redefining gender or proliferating gender and soon there will be no need for gender. It's that we are doing that at the same time that there are a lot of people who are trying to stop us from doing that. And they are transphobic, they are misogynist, they are homophobic. They tend also to be against migrants and to be racist and to be highly nationalistic and masculinist and to believe in patriarchy all the way down. So this is our struggle. This is our historical world. So I don't know another world. I can't take myself out of this world to know another world.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I apologize again for having long and I think complex answers, but I guess that I had the illusion.
You have a lot to say, Joseph, and I hope I get to read what you have to say at some point in time. It would be a great pleasure for me.
Thank you so much. Well, but now it's your time to say things, and I would like to finish with the question because now the interview has come to an end. So excuses for taking a little bit of your time. We're sorry for that,
Fine.
of course.
That's fine.
Well, I have read and we have seen that for some people that they do not consider themselves as radical and as discriminatory or transphobic, but some people claim, for example, that the issues regarding transgender people and women, cisgender women, are different, and we can say that in some part they are, but they tend to establish this distinction between oppression and discrimination, and they want to imply that because transgender people and LGBT plus folks suffer from discrimination and cisgender women suffer from oppression, they say that they are not the same troubles, and when you combine them, you're denying the materiality of the bodies of cisgender women, for example, because they say that women are oppressed because of their very bodies. So they do think that, for example, this gender approach to these problems, they tend to hide or conceal the material reality of that discussion. For example, putting discrimination and oppression in the same category. So what do you think about that? Because there is a work from you that says something like, to be oppressed means that you already exist as a subject of some kind. So it gave me like a new idea of understanding oppression, different from, and discrimination different from this material perspective. But what do you think about that? That's it.
Well, I disagree. I don't believe we can draw a hard and fast distinction between oppression and discrimination. When women who are assigned female at birth are subjected to patriarchal power, it is because patriarchal power has decided that they, as a class, should be reproductive agents within a heteronormative family, that they should not make as much money as men, that their sexuality does not belong to them, that men can do with them as they wish. In each of these cases, and we could name more, all of which are very true. Remember, I'm a very strong feminist. It is a question of power. It is a question of men amassing power and of seeking to deprive women of power and to put them in subordinate positions and vulnerable, even perilous positions within a social structure. So even femicide is the killing of women as women, but they are a social category. In other words, their bodies have already been socially constituted in a certain way. Now, there are really strong links between femicide and the killing of trans people, the killing of gay and lesbian people. I'm not sure I say it right, but in Spanish, there is this feminicidio, which is the killing of anyone who has been feminized, right? So feminization can happen to any number of people. It can happen to gay men. It can happen to trans women. It can happen to butch lesbians who are being told when they're being raped that you are a woman and you will be, and your body will be the free zone of my violence and sexuality, right? So, so there are ways in which I think we need to understand the links among these forms of violence in order to understand the ways in which these are interlocking oppressions. So I disagree that one is simply discrimination and the other is oppression. No, what we call patriarchy has within it homophobia, has within it transphobia. What we call heteronormativity has within it the oppression of women, defined broadly, inclusively, whether or not you were assigned female at birth. And in fact, if we look closely at the anti-gender ideology movement, it puts us all together, right? It's against rape laws. It's against women's reproductive freedom. It's against trans rights. It's against gay and lesbian parenting or gay and lesbian marriage. It's, it has put it all together. And even the idea of gender is understood to link all those different groups. So we are being oppressed, and it is oppression, as an interrelated community. And it would be very foolish to start making a hierarchy like, oh, cis women are more oppressed than trans women. It's like, according to what calculus? Who owns that calculus? Who has devised that calculus? That is a divisive and a divisive move that produces inequalities of oppression. Now, who did that? Well, I remember the old style Marxists saying class is the primary, oppression, and gender is secondary. And we had to fight them forever. So as feminists, so for the feminists to say, oh, cis women have primary oppression, the rest of you only have discrimination. That's the same gesture of hierarchizing oppression. That's not what we need. We need wide networks of solidarity, not just LGBTQI plus, not just feminist, but also anti-racist, affirming of migrant rights, anti-extractivism, like anti-climate destruction, anti-fascism. We need to be expanding these solidarities at this moment. Otherwise, we are all going to be left with authoritarian regimes who are unleashing paramilitary groups and militarized police on their own people. We don't have time for that kind of a distinction, not in my view.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. I guess that this interview has come to a conclusion. It was really, really. I will transcribe this your answers because they have pointed so many things that I was like asking to myself and to some people reading your work. Let me tell you, I'm gonna have a fanboy moment, but your work has inspired me a lot, and it has taught me so many things. So I appreciate that, in the fact that you have taken your time to solve those questions
Okay.
or enlighten them. It is so like important to me, and
All
I
right.
guess that
It
to
was
all
my
the
pleasure. It was my
yeah.
pleasure. Thank you so much.
So well,
Okay.
thank you so much for having for accepting this interview.
It was great. Thank you. Muchas
Bye.
gracias. Okay.
Bueno, quiero agradecerle a la profesora Butler y a Joseph, sin quienes pues este episodio tan bonito e interesante no hubiese sido posible. Y también quiero agradecerle a todas las personas que nos han acompañado a lo largo del programa. Espero pues que podamos disfrutar de más encuentros con la profesora Butler y ojalá en condiciones más favorables. No olviden escucharnos todos los jueves por la 98.5 por el programa de Saga en Contexto, que es nuestro programa radial. Y no olviden tampoco que tenemos abierta una Aquí para que puedan pues apoyar todos los proyectos como el que estamos haciendo de Saga Sin Fronteras. No siendo más, pues les agradecemos muchísimo. Esperamos que hayan disfrutado esta conversación. Y nada, cuídense mucho.